When you have found your place, please stand with me. God speaks to us through the Apostle Paul with a question. Do you not know that you are a temple of God and that the Spirit of God dwells in you? If any man destroys the temple of God, God will destroy him. For the temple of God is holy, and that is what you are. Let no man deceive himself. If any man among you thinks that he is wise in this age, he must become foolish, so that he may become wise. For the wisdom of this world is foolishness before God. For it stands eternally written, He is the one who catches the wise in their craftiness. And again, the Lord knows the reasonings of the wise, that they are useless. So then, let no one boast in men, for every single solitary thing belongs to you. Whether Paul or Apollos or Cephas or the world or life or death or things present or things to come, every single solitary thing belongs to you, and you belong to Christ, and Christ belongs to God. So I want to take you back this morning, but I can't go back as far as I'd like to go. There's so much more that I wanted to say from last week, but the Lord gave me some relief late yesterday evening when He reminded me of a sermon, Lord willing, that I will preach here in just a few weeks. But we have not left behind the issue of quality, and that's really what I did not want to leave behind. There was much more that I wanted to say in the passages that we're in this week, but we're moving forward, but we're not leaving the idea of quality behind. We're actually carrying the issue of quality to a much deeper place, and it is somewhat difficult to understand. And so I'm trying not to be loud, I'm trying not to be fast this morning, I'm trying to be very clear, because to me, this is one of the most profound truths that we've passed through in 1 Corinthians. I really want you to understand it, and so I'm committed to slowing down and spending time in it this morning. But I think it goes without saying that churches in every day, evidently, have been much more interested in reflecting the culture around them rather than the God who saved them. That's certainly what's taking place here at Corinth as we walk through this letter. There was something powerfully influential that had captured the hearts and the attention of the culture around them. And as best we can tell from church history, it was a time where men found philosophy. And so they were able to sit somewhere in some sort of public area or arena and very eloquently communicate, wax if you will, this philosophy, this thinking, these ideas that they had arrived at in their own mind. And the people were really enamored at this ability. It was almost like going to watch a movie or a show. It captured your attention, it lifted your hearts, and it was probably applause-worthy. They had not TV, they didn't have internet, they didn't have those sort of things. So there were some things that captured their attention. Certainly athletics did, or sports did. But here we had this new thing that was building in the context of culture, and it was men's ability to speak. And it had its moments of lifting and lows and all this stuff, just like music does as well. Men had found this ability, and there were some incredibly gifted men doing this. And somewhere along the way, there was an individual that brought this into the church. Now, in the text that we'll be in this morning, God has a special word for that particular individual, and it is a terrifying word of judgment. But he brought it before the church, and the church was just like we are in our day. They were way too caught up in the culture around them. They wanted to be too much like the culture and not enough like the God who dwelt among them. And so when this particular individual brought this idea, this new thing from the culture into the church, the people responded exactly the same way that the culture was responding. They were blown away by this. And so they took this ability and they Christianized it. They used similar Christian methods, but they were using the philosophy and the eloquence. Paul called it clever speech or persuasive words. That's how Paul called it. Not necessarily getting too far away from the gospel. There was enough Jesus and enough gospel so as not to offend anyone to the church, but they had, again, taken that new thing that was going on and they Christianized it and brought it into the context of the church, and they thought they were great for having done that. I wrote these words down. You know, one of the key characteristics of God, I would submit to you God's favorite word for himself. I've heard it pronounced different ways. I pronounce it chesed. Some people pronounce it kesed. Most often it's translated loving kindness, but sometimes it's translated covenantal faithfulness, right? And when I think of that particular characteristic that morning, this is the definition that I want you to hang on to. God is faithful to his people. And so as a people, should we not demonstrate that same attitude, that same characteristic back toward our Father in being faithful to him, knowing the covenant that he has made with us through the blood of his Son? And yet, rather being faithful to God and his covenant, we find ourselves prostituting ourselves out to culture and adopting their ways, their methods, their thinking, Christianizing it and bringing it to the pulpit. And of course, since you're used to it because it's the culture that you live in, you feel like just doing this. Oh, I recognize that. That's so good. That's so helpful. And I love how you mix Jesus in with that. Now, I know you guys don't do that, but I'm trying to help you understand. Where we're going this morning is profoundly important because Paul has been arguing against this all along. But now he's reached the most significant argument, the most powerful argument. And I really want you to understand it because he's going to use this argument several times throughout this letter. And the argument that he used then is the argument that we should use today. In other words, when we see these cultural issues being brought into the church, when we begin to see these cultural ideas and these cultural philosophies being brought into the church, I would submit to you the most powerful argument against that is the one that I bring to you this morning that Paul is using against Corinth. And by the way, I know we've been stacking these arguments up. This is the last one. This is the last thing Paul's going to say about this business of boasting in men. And so he really, if you will, drops the hammer at this point and lays out an argument that is extraordinary. They should immediately walk away from this idea of boasting in men. So here it goes. It begins with a particular phrase that we find really all over the Bible, but especially in the New Testament. Notice verse 16 of 1 Corinthians chapter 3. Paul says these words, these 4 words, "Do you not know?" And if you think to yourself, boy, that sounds like a lot like sarcasm, it is. In fact, Paul is about to get offensively sarcastic as we walk through chapter 4. Now, this phrase, "do you not know," like I said, it's used in a number of times. One commentator said 29 times. I only counted 16 in the New Testament, but it's used 10 times in 1 Corinthians. And when you consider the context of a people who are so proud of what they think they knew, you could translate what he's saying here. Could it be that you who know so much do not know? And then he lays out the principle here. So you're supposed to be pricked by this. You're supposed to be somewhat offended by this. In fact, Jesus had a special little phrase that was very sharp. And he used it toward particular people that it would have poked very hard. You probably remember the phrase. It went like this, another 4 words, have you not read? And he would say that to the Pharisees and the Sadducees and the scribes, people who, oh yeah, they've read. They spend every day, hours a day reading, and they have it memorized. And so for Jesus to say, have you not read, was a bit of a slap in the face. But he was trying to get them, through sharp sarcasm, to think about what you've read. I know you've read it. I know you've memorized it, but you've missed entirely its meaning. And what's fascinating about that is the meaning was never hidden in allegory. God's Word is simple. Some of it requires a measure of thought, like where we find ourselves this morning, but it's plain, it's simple. It's meant to be understood and applied to life. It's meant to shape living. It's meant to change thinking. And so Jesus had this phrase, and here Paul has this phrase. Like I said, we've not left behind the issue of quality because we've not left behind the word what. I didn't realize this week, Paige picked it up in the women's Bible study, in 1 Corinthians 3:5, not all the translations translate it to the word what. Some of it translates it to the word who, and when you do, you miss it. You miss what Paul's trying to do here. So he helps us again in verse 5 with particular individuals, namely those who minister the word of God, in verse 5 where he says, what is Apollos and what is Paul? Now I'll tell you this, Paul's got 4 more words for himself before we get to the end of chapter 4. And he's going to use all 4 words to shape your understanding of the ministry of those who use the word of God in the church. But the foundational word that he wants to use is the word what. And of course, you know the answer to that is the word servant. Now he goes, what is the church? Not who is the church. But he says, I want you to understand what you are as the congregation of God, as the people of God. So notice with me in verse 16, and I'll read through verse 17, and you'll see the question. Do you not know that you are, I'll read it literally, temple of God, and that the Spirit of God dwells in you? If any man destroys the temple of God, God will destroy him, for the temple of God is holy, and that is what you are. He did it again. So if I ask the question, and I translate it plural, what are y'all? What would your answer be? It should be temple of God. Now, some of your translations again add the word the. It is not there. There is no article there. Because there is no article there, some of your translations add the word a, because the English language doesn't work well without an article. But the Greek language not only works well, but it has profound meaning when it does not have an article. So in other words, you are not the temple of God. If that were implied, Corinth would be the site of the temple of God, and it could not be found anywhere else. And if he said a temple of God, he would not be dealing with the issue of quality at all. So you're not a temple of God as among many temples of God all over the place. He simply says this, you are temple of God, which is an issue of quality. Now, I know you struggle with that, so I'm going to spend a great deal of time hopefully explaining that. We did just a couple of weeks ago. Go with me to Hebrews chapter 1. Because that is where my favorite place is, where you don't find an article in the text. And you see the issue of quality. Hebrews chapter 1, verse 1. This is going to be familiar with you. I asked Paige as soon as we got home a couple of weeks ago. I was like, how was that? Hebrews 1, do you get it now? She said, yes. But I want to go there again and again and again, I'm sure, because this is a very important thing for us to understand when we find it in the text. It has meaning. Hebrews chapter 1, verse 1. God, the Father, after he spoke long ago to the fathers, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and so forth. He spoke to them in the prophets. How so? in many portions and in many ways. In these last days, he has spoken to us in Son, not in a son, not in his son. Both of those are incorrect. In Son, that's how it is in the language, which is very confusing. But when you begin to read, you'll understand the issue of the quality of the Son. Now watch this. Whom he appointed heir of all things, through whom also he made the world. He, the Son, here you go. This explains the Son without an article. He is the radiance of his glory, the exact representation of his nature. And he upholds all things by the word of his power. So how did God speak? Through the quality, through the character, through the person, through the nature of the Son. That's why it's worded that way. He didn't speak to us through the Son. He did not speak to us through a son. Boy, that'll get you over into Jehovah's Witness really quickly. He spoke to us through the nature of the Son. Meaning, if you spent the day in a deer stand with the Son, you would walk away from that and go, I know exactly the quality, the character, the nature of God Himself. You're like, how do you know that? Because I spent all day with the Son. And to know the nature of the Son is to know the nature of the Father. And so when God says, I spoke through the quality of the Son, this is how He communicates that. I spoke to you in Son. And so when Paul says, and you can make your way back there to 1 Corinthians chapter 3, when he says you are temple of God, what he's talking about is an issue of quality. You are by quality, by nature, by essence, by character, the people among whom God dwells. Now, I have not been able to get past that phrase this week. I have said that to myself so many times, and it overwhelms me every single time. You are the people among whom the God who created the heaven and the earth lives. And that ought to be absolutely mind-blowing to you. Now, isn't it true that me as an individual, could that not be said about me? Absolutely. If you'll look over in chapter 6, look down at verse 18, because Paul's going to use the exact same illustration in dealing with sexual immorality. Same illustration about the temple. Now it's applied to the individual in regard to the problem of immorality. Flee immorality, Paul says in 1 Corinthians 6:18. Every other sin that a man commits is outside the body, but the immoral man sins against his own body. Do you not know that your body is a temple of the Holy Spirit who is in you, whom you have from God, and that you're not your own? For you've been bought with a price, therefore glorify God in your body. This is his last argument in regard to immorality. Do you not know that your body is by quality temple of God and that God dwells within you? How could you ever commit any form of immorality? And so if you understand the passage, you roll up under the pew and begin to weep and call out to God and cry out to God and confessing your sin. Because you go, I had forgotten, Lord, that you dwelt within me in person, in Christ. How could I have ever defiled you? How could I have brought what I brought before my eyes? I forgot that I brought them before yours. Oh God, forgive me. You see how this works? But in chapter 3, he's brought it to your attention as the church. He's like, do you not know that you're the people among whom I dwell? And so if you ask the question, how in the world does this principle cause me to want to put aside the wisdom of the world? I think if I stopped here, like 99.99%, if not 100% of y'all would go home and figure that one out. But I want to belabor the point because I want you to understand what it means to be, without the article, by quality temple of God. Let me give you a couple illustrations. Let's just say, by the miraculous power of God, he did it for the Apostle Paul, took you to glory for the summer. And so you got to spend the entire summer not at camp, struggling through worship. You got to spend the entire summer in the temple of God in glory. Let's just say there is a physical temple. It's not spiritual, it's physical. God dwells in that temple. And then you come back after a summer, and someone's like, where have you been all summer? You wouldn't believe me if I told you. That's what Paul says, so I'm not going to tell you. But you're like, no, tell me. I spent the entire summer in heaven in the temple. You what? Yeah, I like lived there for the summer. Well, tell me, what in the world was that like? Was God there? Oh yeah, every day. It's his house. He was there. Well, describe it for me. And so you begin to describe the qualities. Oh, the ornateness of the temple was indescribable. The stone, the precious jewels, the gold. I just can't tell you how extraordinary it was to be inside the temple. The quality of the temple was incredible. But there's so much more. How else could you describe it? Oh, listen, the nature of it, the character of it. I don't have words for that. I've never felt like that. To know holiness like that, to know beauty like that, to know love like that, to know joy and freedom like that, the character of it, the quality of it, the nature of it, the essence of it. I can't describe it for you, but it's so familiar to me. It's all I want now. I cannot wait to go back. I can't believe I got to spend this summer there in the presence of God, enjoying the nature of God, the person of God. Is there anything here that reminds you of that? And as tears begin to roll down your face, you go, yeah, there is a people in the design of God that is supposed to give you precisely that feeling. There is a people that I have left behind on earth that is supposed to fill you with the same joy. You're supposed to have a taste of that holiness in your mouth and that righteousness, that freedom and that forgiveness. You're like, where in the world is that? Because I want to go there, and spend the rest of my days. You go, it's the church. It's not a physical place. They could never create a building like it. But he did create a people like it. He did create a people that is, he calls them the temple of God, but he calls it in a unique way. They are by quality just temple of God. And to dwell among those people, I'm telling you, I can smell it. It smells just like the kingdom of heaven. I've got that taste in my mouth that I love so much. It's that taste that I had last summer, having spent the entire summer in the temple of God in glory in heaven. And every time I gather with the church, I get that taste. I have that smell. I just love it so much. You see, this has profound meaning. Let me give you another one that's not so high and glorious. Do y'all remember your grandparents' home? Sheila, do you remember the dark pine panels that was on the wall in the living room? I don't know why I remember that. I remember the smells. The house is long since burned down. I remember where the kitchen was. I remember where the living room was. I remember where the bedroom was. It was an incredible small house, my grandparents. It was over in Henniger. And every year, all the grandkids would gather, and we'd all sleep in the living room. Wood stove, right? Wood stove. It was freezing cold. That house was might as well have been a tent. It was so drafty. And that floor was freezing, but the fire was raging. And so you had the smell of the smoke. You had the smell of fried potatoes and pintos or green beans coming from the kitchen. That was quite pleasant. And so I've got all this that forms the character of that feeling, of that nature of being there. But you know what influences that the most? The personality of my grandmother and my grandfather. That influences that the most. And if your grandparents had that pleasantness about them, that joy about them, I could still hear my grandfather laughing. Not everybody got to hear that. I was the unquestionable favorite of my grandfather. I say that unashamedly. Still hear that laughter. Still hear my grandmother. And it was their character that shaped my memory of that more than anything else, good or bad. And it wasn't all good. But if I could put you in that place as a small child and take you there and give you that illustration and then pull you back out and say to you, when God says that this local body of Christ at Corinth is supposed to give the people a taste of what it would be like to spend a summer at the temple of the Lord in glory, that's what Paul's talking about here. He wants you to have the same smells. He wants you to have the same taste. But what makes it the most significant? It is the character of God that makes the feeling, the nature, the most significant. And that's why God says about the Son, He is the exact representation of my nature. And then when He brings it into the church, He's like, guys, this is my design for you. I want you to be the representation of me, of who I am as a people who are holy before the Lord. Can you see why this argument is extraordinary for putting down the wisdom of the world? Let me lay a little bit of an Old Testament foundation for you, because I want you to see their failure in the design of God, that even though it was perfect. But then I want to bring you into the New Testament, see the design of God in the church, and then I want you to consider our failures, because I'm afraid that we're not faring so well. In the Old Testament, if you're taking notes, I'll give you the passages, but you don't have to turn there. God says this after rescuing a people to Himself in Leviticus 26:11. He says, moreover, this is the glorious moment for them. I will make my dwelling among you, and my soul will not reject you. I will also walk among you and be your God, and you shall be my people. That's like the glory moment. It's the glory moment for us when we get to heaven. What's so glorious about heaven? God is there, period. He's the prize. He's the joy. He's the reward. And so these people, having been rescued from Egypt, gets this taste in their mouth when God says, oh, no, listen, I'm going to be with you. And He gives the expression, I'm going to walk among you. And you're like, what? And God's like, I'm going to give you a visible demonstration of my presence among you. And so He instructs them to build the tabernacle. And when they get completed, and this is the point that we talked about quality last week, like after Moses did it exactly like God said, here's your last passage, verse 34 of Exodus 40. Then the cloud covered the tent of the meeting, and the glory of the Lord filled the tabernacle. And Moses was not able to enter the tent of the meeting because the cloud had settled on it, and the glory of the Lord filled the tabernacle. And so there we are, a visible manifestation of the presence of God among a people. And so you ask the question, what made Israel different than anybody else on the planet? One thing and one thing alone. God dwelt among them. That's it. That was the difference. But because God dwelt among them, was that supposed to reflect in how the people lived their life? Yes. So not only did you have a visible manifestation of the temple, you had a moral demonstration of what it was like to live among God. And so all the other nations around them were supposed to look, see the temple, and know, oh, that's the God who created the heavens and the earth. And that's the God who laid waste to Egypt. And look at the people. Don't the people remind you of Him? That was the plan. God's like, I gave you everything you needed. What did he give him? I gave you the law. It's not as though I didn't tell you how to live. I told you how to live down to the greatest of detail, and you are supposed to be a reflection of what it means to live among me by giving the people a taste of my nature. How'd they do? No, they failed. What did they wind up looking like before they ever arrived at the promised land? Everybody else around them. So we get a fresh start. We get there. Joshua's leading us. Everything's glorious. The days of David follow thereafter soon enough, continuing in that glory through a difficult period, I know. Solomon's days, tremendous. And it's time once again for us to erect a structure that's going to represent the presence of God. And so we're going to build the temple of God. Now, this is what God says before they complete the temple, or before they begin really the process. And this is found in 1 Kings chapter 6, verse 12, if you're taking notes. God says to Solomon these words concerning this house which you are building. If you will walk in my statutes and execute my ordinances and keep all my commandments by walking in them, then I will carry out my word with you, which I spoke to David your father. And here's his word. I will dwell among the sons of Israel and will not forsake my people Israel. Here's your grand prize. I'm going to dwell among you in the promised land. And so they construct the temple. And when they are finished, here are the words in 1 Kings chapter 8. It happened that when the priests came from the holy place, the cloud filled the house of the Lord so that the priests could not stand to minister because of the cloud. For the glory of the Lord filled the house of the Lord. And here we go again. You've got a visible manifestation of the presence of God among the people. And you're like, who is that God as you sit there as a surrounding nation? And you go, He's the God that delivered them from Egypt. He's the God that led them 40 years from the desert. And I even heard the story that their shoes never wore out. Crazy as that thought is. But He's provided for them every single day. And would you believe He even fed them bread from heaven? And when they got to the promised land, they were so outpowered, outnumbered, outsized in every way, shape, and form. And these people actually laid waste to these giants. And I want you to look down the hill there. There's the temple that God dwells. And look at those people. Those are the people among whom that God lives. Can you imagine being those people? He's their chosen. He's their loved. And so you ask the question, I wonder if by looking at the people, we can understand better their God. I wonder if by being their neighbors, we're going to understand and know what their God is like. That was the plan. What made them distinct? I'll ask you that question again. There was only one thing that made the nation of Israel distinct. There was only one thing that made Jerusalem distinct. And it was the presence of God among His people. Period. So how did they fare? You know the end of that story. In fact, if you think about the promise that comes to them in Ezekiel 36, what does God say to them? You have profaned my name. Can you imagine? I built the temple. The glory of the Lord filled the temple. I was one of those people who lived among God. God's dwelling place was among us. And yet, rather than reflecting the character of God, rather than being that which is by quality the people of God, God says, I wound up looking exactly like the people around me. And God responds with these words, you have profaned my name. The people did not understand that the temple was a visible manifestation and a moral demonstration of who God is by quality. If you remember, and I just mentioned this because we've been going through Jeremiah, the prophet warned them saying, do not trust in the deceptive word saying this is the temple of the Lord, the temple of the Lord, the temple of the Lord. They totally misunderstood the significance of the temple of the Lord. It wasn't a quality issue for them. It was an issue of military defiance and success. And God was like, oh no, I didn't build the temple for that. I built the temple to remind you of who I am and my requirements upon your life. So did they succeed? Absolutely not. But here comes a temple that succeeds in every single solitary way. Jesus himself referred to his own body as the temple of the Lord. It's found in John 2 and verse 19. Jesus answered them, destroy this temple and in 3 days I will raise it up. And then the Jew says, it took 46 years to build this temple and you're going to raise it in 3 days. But John tells us he was speaking of the temple of his body. And if you want a demonstration of the feeling, I would take you to the baptism when the Spirit descended upon him like a dove, if you need that illustration. But when you ask the question, was Jesus a visible manifestation and a moral demonstration of the person of God? In every single solitary way. That's why God can say, in the last days that I ever spoke, in my final word to you, I spoke to you in Son. Because if you'll look at the Son, oh, you get more than a taste of what I'm like. You get the exact representation of my nature. That's what it means to be, by quality, Son of God. So again, I remind you, the believer's that way, but Paul's not concerned with that here because the problem has categorically consumed the entire church at Corinth. And so if you're not there, look at 1 Corinthians chapter 3, verse 16. What does it mean to be the temple of the Lord? And how in the world does this apply to walking in the wisdom of the world? 1 Corinthians 3:16 says, do you not know that you are temple of God and that the, notice, Spirit of God dwells in you? Oh man, I don't know how many times you can lay that foundation in the Old Testament before you get to the New Testament. You figure out the church is it. Is our responsibility as the church any different than it's ever been? Absolutely not. We are supposed to be a visible and moral demonstration of the nature of the God who lives among us. We are the people, I'll say it to you, we are the people among whom God dwells. Now ask yourself the question, is it making a difference? We know what the people of Corinth were doing. But as we look across the landscape of the church today, are we doing anything differently? Now here's what you don't want to do. Oh, Corinth Baptist Church is doing well. Well, this pastor thinks so too. But our concern needs to be for the church. It was for the Apostle Paul. And when we come to this understanding, really at this moment, if we really grasp what God is doing through the church by leaving her here, at this point we really should all be weeping. And I should not be able to finish preaching. We have such a profound, joyous responsibility before a lost and dying, godless world. They are supposed to be able to come in here and sit down and go, you know, I know what God smells like now. I know that taste that you get in your mouth when you're around God. It's just so pleasant, so satisfying. I know what the character of God is like. I know what it's like on Sunday afternoon to go down to the house of the Lord and be with the Lord because He is among His people. We ought to rejoice at the privilege of being these people, but we ought to take well our responsibility I could give you a number of examples, and I do need to finish the text, and I will. The rest of it, now that you understand it, we go through it without difficult whatsoever. You'll understand the rest of it easily. But when you think about the things that we are dealing with and have dealt with, when you think about how quickly all these social and moral issues are so easily taken up in the church and accepted so quickly, the reason for that is the same reason that it happened at Corinth in this letter. It was what was going on in the culture. It was the latest, it was the greatest thing. The people were exposed to it outside the church, and some, and I'll use the word biblically, I'll show it to you in a minute, some moron brought it into the church. And because you were accustomed to it, and because you saw the stir that it was creating in the culture, you Christianized it and stirred the church with it. Example, the latest one is multi-ethnic. It turns out the qualifications for church leadership in the Bible are not sufficient. And so I need enough Black or Hispanic or Chinese elders, because this needs to be a multi-ethnic body to glorify God. One of the largest Baptist churches follows that teaching. I appreciate Miss Barbara singing. I really do, as a side note. So wonderful to hear your voice this morning. But next Sunday, I'm going to have to ask a Black individual to lead us in song, because we need to be multi-ethnic. That's the thinking that's been brought into this church, because if you'll notice, corporations and businesses have followed this multi-ethnic idea. If you'll notice, the television shows follow this multi-ethnic idea. And some moron thought it would fit well in the church, and so we Christianized it and we adopted it in the church so well. And all the large churches are doing it now. Any Sunday you can hear just a number of racial or ethnic people get up and lead worship or be behind the pulpit. It really comes back to the question, are you going to look like the culture around you, or are you going to look like the God who saved you? And the warning to those who handle the Word of God, Paul says this, remember your foundation. Do you remember God did not trust anybody to build that part? God built that part Himself. And it was the foundation of Jesus Christ and Him crucified. And as you go up with that building, Paul issues the warning to builders, you better build it to reflect the foundation. It better be precisely the same nature and character of the one upon which it is found. And if you make it look like anything or anybody else, it will burn, per Paul. So I want you to notice verse 17, and again, we've got just a few more verses. I'm on my last page of notes. We'll blow through them quickly. But look at verse 17. The problem was systemic. We know that all the way back from chapter 1, verse 12. Each one of you is saying these things. So Paul says it's not affected a few. This is not a small group. This is absolutely everybody. But in verse 17, he goes singular. If any man, singular, destroys the temple of God, God will destroy him. So it's a warning that the man that's responsible, the moron that he'll say, for introducing this idea in the church has a day with the Lord. And it will not go well for him. And we have Old Testament illustrations for that. I'll give you one. We don't have to turn there, but Numbers 16 gives you a man by the name of Korah. And the subtitle of that chapter, if you have subtitle, is Korah's Rebellion. Korah decided he was tired of Moses' leadership. Korah decided that anybody can lead. His ideas were just as good as the shepherd that God had installed. And so Korah leads out 250 men of reputation to overthrow Moses. Now, if you remember how this story ends, he had his day with the Lord. And Moses prays, Lord, if this is of you, let this be incredibly unusual in how you deal with this man. And so everybody goes to their tent, and God moves in such a way as the ground under Korah's tent opened up and swallowed Korah and his family live down into Sheol. God says, you messed with my congregation, I will deal with you. You're the one that introduced this mess into the community, that Moses is just some guy and he's not leading or shepherding this body. You wanted to take the reins from him. And so I'm going to demonstrate to these other 250 people who did get swallowed how I'm going to deal with the man that started it. And he was completely obliterated, his entire family. Jesus puts the words this way, Matthew 18:7. You don't have to turn there. Woe to the world because of its stumbling blocks. For it is inevitable that stumbling blocks come, but woe to that man through whom the stumbling block comes. You better be very careful. One, I'm about to show you of not getting swept up into this garbage that comes straight out of the world. But the harshest warning comes from the one who introduces it into the body. God doesn't play with that guy. God has no grace for that guy. God has judgment for that guy. Now notice verse 18, and I'll finish up with the warning that comes to you all not to get swept up with this. Let no man deceive himself. Don't lie to yourself. If any man singular among you thinks, so he's saying every single one of you, I want you to understand this. If any of you think that you're wise in this age, he must become, here's your word, moron, so that he may become wise. Now, what is he talking about? How do I need to become a moron? You become a moron in the eyes of the world. In other words, as the world runs off in their wisdom to do all these things, the church continues that age-old path that's been set before us of Jesus Christ and Him crucified, and they look at us as outdated. They look at us and they use the word conservative, which completely drives me crazy. The word orthodox I'm okay with. But they look at us as if we're stupid. When we begin to speak of creation, as God spoke and it was so, they look at us and they go, what a bunch of morons. And God goes, oh, hold on to that one. You're the kind of morons that really know something. When we begin to speak of the beauty and the purity of Christ as the way and the truth and the life, and no man will ever, ever, ever be accepted by the Father but through Him, the world looks at that and goes, you're so not inclusive. And the church is like, yes, I am. I preach that same message to all. And they go, you're just a moron. And God goes, no, you're wise. And so you look at these perspectives and you realize, if I'm going to follow Christ, my classmates, my college mates, my workmates, my neighbors in the world, it's a 99.99% chance they're going to think I'm an absolute idiot. And God says, no, you're now pursuing wisdom, true wisdom. Look what God does in verse 19. For the wisdom of the world is foolishness before God, for it stands written, He is the one who catches, it's like a trap, a fox trap. He is the one who catches the wise in their craftiness. In other words, He uses their own wisdom to prove their ignorance. In verse 20, He says it in a different way. The Lord knows all the reasonings of the wise, the people of the world, and they are useless. Let me say this to teachers, because we have a great deal of teachers in here. And so I want to offend everyone, right? That's what I usually do. I'm just kidding. You guys get exposed to so much. Seems like every year somebody is bringing new material to you to teach you some new philosophy about how to educate people. Some new idea, some new approach, some new way of doing. It's the new version. Beloved, be careful of thinking that would ever have any value in the church of God. And I bring that up because many years ago, I did have someone, principal or vice principal, Rob, I'm sure, brought me literature and go, hey, I would consider and read this. This is absolutely amazing. This has revolutionized education. You should read this for the church. I was nice. I took it home and threw it away. But the thing the world teaches us does not apply here. The way the world grows business, that I'll get into one day, it's my high horse, right? Does not apply here. This is not a business. This is a family. We don't need a CEO. We need a dad. This is the wisdom of God. So then here's his grand conclusion after teaching us this truth. So then, let no one boast in men. Can you imagine spending the summer in the temple of God in glory, coming home, and someone says, how was it? And you go, man, there was this guy there. He was so funny. He's the guy that mowed the yard. Just an incredible guy. Made the biggest impression on me. And you're looking at this guy like you're a fool. And you should. Because he literally just spent the summer with God in the house of God. And you're coming back talking to me about the guy who mowed the yard? What's wrong with you? And so Paul gets to this conclusion. You are by quality the temple of God. How in the world would you ever boast in a man? Are you kidding me? God lives among you and you want to talk about a man? Have you lost your mind? See how this works? Oh, it's a powerful argument if you get the argument. There's no way in any shape or form we would ever take something out of the world and bring it into the temple of God and go, hey, God, I've got a great idea. The world's doing it. They love it. It'll grow the numbers of heaven, Lord. I'll be nice. It doesn't apply. It doesn't work. It's useless. Look at the last statement, verse 21, and then we're praying we're done. And it's very emphatic, by the way. When it says for all things, it is emphatic. Everything belongs to you. Every single solitary thing. And then Paul tries to cover all of his bases. So this is the purpose of 22. Whether Paul or Apollos or Cephas, none of that matters. They all belong to you. Or the world and anything in the world and of the world, it all belongs to you. Life, death, from life to death, every moment in between, every circumstance, everything, it all belongs to you. Things here, things there, it all belongs to you. Every single thing. And you're like, what? How? I'll tell you how, because it all belongs to Christ. And you're the bride of Christ. And since Jesus possesses it all and is Lord over all, and you have been brought into the marriage relationship with Christ, Paul can faithfully say, listen, there's nothing physical, spiritual, here, there, anywhere. There's absolutely nothing that you'll ever run across that does not belong to you as the bride of Christ. And then he goes one step further, and Christ belongs to God. And you're just like, we are so significant as the church of God, as the bride of God. But the question remains, will that make the difference? The singular thing that God dwells among us, the one thing that is supposed to make us distinct, will it do so? Or will we continue to adopt the world and its ways and bring them into the temple? Let's pray.